The photograph had been studied for decades and dismissed just as long. A sepia-toned studio portrait from 1910, perfectly composed, softly lit, the kind of image that once hung in parlors and family halls. A young girl sat on a wooden chair, her boots barely touching the floor, lace sleeves buttoned to her wrists. Her hair was neatly parted, her posture rigid in the way children were taught to be when adults were watching. Everything about it whispered calm, tradition, and patience. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. The backdrop was hand-painted clouds, the kind photographers favored to suggest elegance. The girl's expression was neutral, neither smiling nor afraid. Just the blank obedience common in early photography, when holding still mattered more than comfort. Experts catalogued it as another harmless relic of a quieter time. Peaceful, ordinary, safe. It wasn't until someone enlarged the image far beyond what had ever been necessary that the silence of the photo began to feel deliberate. Her hands were folded in her lap, small fingers curled around something dark and narrow. At normal scale, it blended into the shadows of her dress. But under magnification, the shape sharpened. It was not a toy, not a book, not anything a child should have been instructed to hold for a portrait meant to preserve innocence. The object looked heavy, as though it didn't belong in her grip. And the way she held it wasn't casual, it was careful, almost practiced. Then came the detail no one could explain. Her eyes were not focused on the camera. They were angled slightly downward, fixed on what rested in her hands as if she were listening to it. Waiting. And once that realization settled in, the photograph no longer felt like a moment captured in time, but a warning frozen just before something irreversible happened. The photograph resurfaced the way forgotten things often do, not through intention but accident. A mislabeled archive box, pulled from a temperature-controlled basement during a digitization project meant to clear space rather than uncover history. Inside were dozens of glass plate negatives wrapped in yellowing paper, most of them cracked, some fused together by time. Landscapes, stiff family portraits, storefronts that no longer existed, and among them, one studio image that appeared almost pristine, as if neglect had passed it by on purpose. At first, the image attracted no special attention. Early 20th century studio portraits were common, endlessly similar in posture and tone. The girl in the photograph fit every expectation: centered composition, neutral background, careful lighting designed to soften youth into something idealized. Her name was not recorded. The photographer's stamp was faint but legible, tied to a small studio that operated briefly in a mid-sized industrial town. Nothing about it suggested importance, let alone danger. Archivists logged it, scanned it, and moved on. Weeks later, the image began circulating among specialists, not because it was remarkable, but because it was complete. In a collection full of damage and decay, this one survived intact. Preservation experts cited it as a reference example when discussing proper exposure techniques of the era. Historians pointed out the clothing, the chair, the painted backdrop, all textbook details of studio work from around 1910. The photograph became a quiet favorite, comforting in its familiarity, a reminder of how orderly the past could appear when stripped down to a single frame. Peaceful was the word most often used. It appeared in lectures, then articles, then a small exhibition on early portraiture. Visitors lingered on it longer than expected, though no one could quite explain why. The girl's stillness had a gravity to it. She didn't smile, but that wasn't unusual. She didn't fidget, which suggested discipline, good upbringing. The photograph felt composed, respectful, safe, an image that asked nothing of the viewer except appreciation. For a time, it represented exactly what people wanted from history: simplicity, innocence, a world where danger felt distant and adulthood arrived slowly. It was a visual lullaby, sepia-toned and reassuring, an artifact that seemed to say nothing bad had happened here. Nothing bad was about to happen. Nothing bad could reach through time and touch present. That assumption remained unchallenged until curiosity, not suspicion, led someone to look closer, not because they expected to find something wrong, but because they believed with absolute confidence that nothing was there to be found. The shift began with a routine request, the kind made every day by researchers who believed they already understood what they were looking at. A private conservator asked for a high-resolution enlargement of the photograph, intending to study the lighting technique around the subject's hands. Early studio photographers often struggled with shadows in that area, and the image had been praised for its balance. The request was technical, almost boring, and no one expected it to change how the photograph was seen. When the scan came back, the first reaction was confusion rather than alarm. At a higher resolution, the dark shape resting in the girl's lap separated itself from the folds of her dress. It was longer than previously assumed, narrow and subtly asymmetrical. The edges were too defined to be fabric, too rigid to be an accessory. Someone suggested it might be a case, perhaps for spectacles or sewing needles, but the size was wrong. Others proposed a religious item, yet it matched none of the common devotional objects from the period. The more the image was magnified, the less innocent the object appeared. There was a weight to it, visible even in stillness, suggested by the tension in the girl's fingers. She wasn't loosely holding it. Her grip was deliberate, the way one holds something that demands care. The object's surface absorbed light rather than reflecting it, creating a void, like darkness that resisted detail. This alone was unusual, as most materials from the era, wood, leather, metal, interacted with studio lighting in predictable ways. Experts began comparing it against catalogs of period items, museum collections, and studio props. Nothing aligned. It was not a toy, despite being held by a child. It was not a book, though it shared the rough dimensions of one. It lacked hinges, clasps, or visible seams. No markings could be found. No indication of craftsmanship familiar to the time. What unsettled them most was how intentionally the object had been included. Studio portraits were carefully staged. Photographers chose props that communicated class, innocence, or aspiration. Children were often posed with dolls, flowers, or empty hands. This object communicated nothing. It offered no narrative, no symbolic comfort. Its presence felt like an intrusion rather than an enhancement, as though it had insisted on being part of the image. Discussion turned quiet as interpretations failed. One researcher pointed out that the object did not match the era, not just stylistically, but conceptually. It seemed out of place in a way that went beyond fashion or technology. Another noted that the girl's fingers partially obscured it, almost protectively, as if concealing it were part of the instruction she'd been given. The photograph, once praised for its serenity, now carried a question it refused to answer, and with that question came a subtle unease, the sense that the image had always been hiding something in plain sight. Once attention shifted away from the object itself, the rest of the photograph began to feel unstable, as though the image resented being scrutinized. Details that had once blended into the background now seemed oddly misaligned. The girl's posture, previously read as proper and composed, revealed a stiffness that went beyond the demands of early photography. Her shoulders were raised just enough to suggest tension, not poise, and her spine was too straight, as if she were bracing rather than posing. Her expression, long dismissed as neutral, no longer felt empty. When examined alongside other portraits of children from the same period, it stood apart. There was no trace of impatience or mild discomfort, emotions common in young subjects forced to sit still. Instead, her face held a quiet vacancy, a look of restraint that seemed practiced, as though she had been told not just to remain still, but not to react at all. The most troubling discovery came from her gaze. In studio portraits, subjects were guided to look directly into the lens or slightly above it, creating the illusion of engagement. The girl's eyes did neither. They angled downward by a fraction, too precise to be accidental. When the line of sight was traced, it did not fall on the floor or her hands, but somewhere just short of them, as if she were focusing on something closer, something only she could see. It gave the impression that her attention was being held not by the photographer but by the object resting in her lap. Lighting inconsistencies added to the unease. The shadows cast by her arms did not fully match the known studio setup of the time, which had been documented in surviving photographs of the same space. The light fell as expected on her dress and face, but around her hands it behaved strangely, flattening in some areas and deepening in others without a clear source. This subtle distortion created the sense that the object disrupted the light rather than simply occupying it. Even the backdrop began to feel wrong. Painted clouds were meant to create softness and depth, but behind the girl the brushwork appeared unusually blurred, as though it had been altered or repainted. Some experts suggested the negative might have been retouched, yet no signs of common correction techniques could be found. If changes had been made, they were careful, almost reverent, as though the goal was not improvement, but concealment. The final inconsistency was temporal. When compared to other photographs taken by the same studio within the same year, the image resisted alignment. The exposure time suggested one date, the clothing another, the photographic plate yet another. Individually, these discrepancies could be explained. Together, they formed a pattern that implied something had been adjusted, staged, or repeated until the result satisfied a requirement no one could identify. The idea that the girl was simply posing gave way to a far more unsettling possibility, that she had been positioned with purpose, instructed with precision, and photographed not to capture a moment but to complete one. As questions multiplied, attention turned outward, away from the photograph itself, and toward the place where it had been made. The studio's name, once a footnote, became a focal point. Records showed it operated for less than 3 years, an unusually short lifespan even for a small-town photography business. At first, this seemed unremarkable. Studios opened and closed frequently in the early 20th century. But when historians began tracing its paper trail, they found it thinning far too quickly. City directories listed the studio for 2 consecutive years, then omitted it entirely. Tax records showed a final payment made months earlier than expected. The building itself appeared in zoning documents long after the business vanished, but under a different designation, its former purpose quietly erased. No advertisement announced a closure. No notice explained a relocation. It was as if the studio had been removed from public life without acknowledgement. More troubling was the absence of people. The photographer's name appeared on the stamp, but beyond that, he was a ghost. Census data placed him in the town briefly, then nowhere. There were no death certificates, no marriage records, no evidence of travel. Assistants, clerks, anyone who might have worked there were equally untraceable. Other studios from the region had left behind apprentices who went on to open their own businesses. This one left nothing, as though everyone associated with it had stepped out of history at the same time. The gaps grew sharper when researchers examined the studio's output. Only a small number of surviving photographs could be confidently attributed to it, far fewer than expected for even a modest operation. The dates clustered tightly together, suggesting a burst of activity followed by abrupt silence. Among those images, several shared subtle similarities. Subjects posed with unusual rigidity, props that defied easy identification, expressions that felt restrained rather than composed. None were as striking as the girl's portrait, but together they suggested a pattern rather than coincidence. Then the records stopped altogether. Local newspapers from the period were searched for fires, scandals, legal disputes, anything that might explain the disappearance. There were none, no mention of an accident, no report of illness. Even rumors, which newspapers of the time eagerly printed, were absent. It was as though the town itself had agreed not to notice the studio's end. One archivist uncovered a final reference buried in a ledger unrelated to photography, a handwritten note marking the building as cleared months before its official sale. No reason was given, no authority signed it. The handwriting did not match any known clerk or official from the period. The more complete the historical record became elsewhere, the more isolated this absence felt, until the disappearance of the studio no longer seemed like a failure of documentation, but a deliberate narrowing, a controlled silence closing in around the moment that photograph was taken. The final discovery did not arrive through images or records, but through inference, the kind that forms when enough negative space begins to outline a shape. By the time researchers returned to the object in the girl's hands, it was no longer viewed as a prop or anomaly, but as the center around which everything else had been arranged. Its purpose was no longer questioned in practical terms, but in intent. One detail had been overlooked early on because it seemed insignificant. The object cast no clear shadow of its own. While her hands created soft, readable contours on her dress, the object itself appeared to consume the light around it, as though the studio lamps had bent away. In early photography, this was nearly impossible. Even dark materials reflected something. This reflected nothing. When the image was inverted and contrast adjusted beyond normal restoration limits, faint markings emerged along one edge, not decorative, not linguistic, but rhythmic. Repetitive indentations, evenly spaced, suggesting use rather than design. They were not carved, they were worn in. The implication unsettled everyone who saw it. The object had been handled repeatedly, perhaps ritualistically, long before the photograph was taken. Attention turned to the girl again, not as a subject, but as a participant. Her fingers were positioned in a way that limited movement, locking the object in place. This was not how a child held something unfamiliar. It was how someone held something they had been trained to hold. Her wrists bore faint compression marks, nearly invisible, suggesting that moments before the photograph, her hands had been guided into position, perhaps held there, perhaps corrected until exactness was achieved. One historian proposed that the photograph was not meant to document the girl at all. It was meant to document the object in the presence of a living human, small enough to be controlled, old enough to understand instructions, innocent enough to be overlooked. The studio, then, was not a business but a controlled environment. The painted backdrop was not decorative but isolating. The rigid posture was not aesthetic but functional. Everything existed to frame a single condition. The object being held contained, acknowledged. A chilling theory followed. What if the object could not be photographed alone? What if its existence required contact to be recorded, not just visually, but symbolically? Early photography carried a belief in capture, not just of images, but of essence. To photograph something was to fix it in time. To photograph it being held was to define its boundary. The disappearance of the studio, the silence of the records, the absence of continuation all pointed to a single conclusion that no one wanted to formalize. The photograph was not a keepsake, it was not a portrait. It was evidence of a process completed, a threshold crossed, and the girl was not chosen because she was special, but because she was sufficient, because once the shutter closed, her role ended, and whatever the object was, it no longer needed to be seen again.